Number 10. German Submarine. If you found a Russian tank in the middle of a cornfield in Kansas, you'd be pretty shocked, right? That's basically what happened here, when an abandoned German submarine from World War II was discovered by amateur divers in a pretty unlikely place. It was found at the bottom of Lake St. Jean in Quebec, Canada. This is a far cry from where most of the fighting was done during World War II. There were no real battles fought on Canadian land during the war, yet this German submarine managed to creep from the ocean, through rivers, and eventually into the lake, where it took out 3 fishing boats before a Canadian destroyer sunk the pesky submarine. For those who don't know, Canada actually entered World War II way before the Americans did. They were considered a major enemy in the eyes of the Germans. To strike at the heart of Canada, the Nazis hatched a plan to send sneaky submarines through rivers to attack industrial targets in Quebec. It didn't really turn out that well since the Canadian destroyers were ready and took out the submarines as soon as they responded. However, this is the only abandoned German sub that's ever been found from the war in Canada. Number 9. Soviet Aircraft Carrier. Yes, somehow machines of war keep ending up in places you'd never expect. The people who uncover them must be absolutely baffled. Currently, there's a Soviet aircraft carrier rotting in a Chinese lagoon. The vessel is a Kiev-class aircraft carrier called the Minsk, which is abandoned 50 miles, 80 kilometers from the city of Shanghai. How it got there was quite a journey. The aircraft carrier began its life in Ukraine in 1972. It was classified as a heavy aviation cruiser with a displacement of 40,000 tons. It could launch anti-ship cruise missiles, it had twin 76mm guns, and it was big enough for jets and helicopters to land on. It wasn't something you'd want to mess with, but something happened it couldn't prevent. It was 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed and the newly formed Russian Navy took possession of the ship. However, it was suffering from engineering problems and had recently experienced a fire in the engine room. The Russians didn't feel like spending the money to fix the ship, so they sold it as scrap. By 1995, the Minsk had made its way to South Korea to be broken apart. That never ended up happening though. The Minsk was purchased by a Chinese entrepreneur who wanted to build a theme park around it. The entrepreneur had the aircraft carrier brought to a lagoon north of Shanghai, but the theme park never really got off the ground. It did open, but just 6 years later the whole operation went bankrupt. Ever since, the Minsk has been rotting in that same lagoon. And yes, it's still there today. You can go see it if you dare. Number 8. Google Street View Car. Some of the most remote parts of the world are home to strange sights and abandoned property, and northern India is no exception. An Opel Astra hatchback was discovered crashed off the side of the road in a rocky ravine in what appears to be a northern part of India. The car was discovered with the Google Street View equipment attached to its roof. Nobody knows exactly what happened to this thing, but it was definitely working for Google. It must have been mapping the local streets when it made a wrong turn and went over a cliff. It even has the Google insignia plastered on the passenger door. We don't know if anyone was injured when the car crashed or why it was left abandoned after the fact. Judging by the dirt that's accumulated on the vehicle, it's been sitting at the bottom of the ravine for several years. Hopefully the replacement car was able to map out this remote path without crashing in the process. Number 7. Abandoned spacecraft. There is a huge half-built spaceship called the Baikal, named so after the biggest lake in Russia, abandoned in Moscow. The abandonment of the craft, like so much of the old technology in the Soviet Union, came in 1991 during the collapse. It was part of the Buran space program, with only a few sister crafts being made as well. However, only one of these orbiters ever managed to reach space. When the Soviet Union fell apart, so too did the space program. The Baikal, along with a few other crafts, were scrapped before they could be finished. Most of them were simply abandoned on the factory floor and eventually turned into scrap metal. The Baikal was dumped outside of the factory in Moscow where it was built. It then sat there in the dust for over 10 years. It was eventually dismantled and moved to a parking lot alongside a canal in Moscow, where somebody put it back together and abandoned it yet again. To this day, the half-finished spaceship is still sitting beside the canal. But if you ever wanted to work on renovating a rocket ship in your spare time, you could probably buy the half-built empty Hulk for a super discounted price. Number 6. Incredible barn find. A group of teenagers made a shocking discovery when they broke into a barn in Brazil and found it packed to the ceiling with classic automobiles dating back to the 1920s. It's pretty rare to find classic cars in barns, never mind an entire sanctuary of classic vehicles. These kids found motorcycles, gas pumps, and American muscle cars from the 1970s. Even more shocking was that the vehicles had pretty much no miles on them, suggesting they'd been purchased or moved into the barn immediately after leaving the country. But just where in the world did all these cars come from? According to local Brazilian media, the barn was once a private museum. It was never open to the public, with the owner only showing off his cars to his friend. After the owner of the cars died, his heirs had no idea what to do with all the classic cars, and so they abandoned them in the barn. These guys must have been pretty wealthy to leave such valuable vehicles as a 1952 Style Line, a 1969 Fiat 124 Sport Coupe, and even an original Ford Model T. I wonder who got to sell off the stash of vintage cars and profit from the discovery. Who do you think should? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section down below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 5. Death in a Ford truck. Back in 2019, an abandoned Ford truck in Queens made news headlines when a decomposing corpse was discovered sitting casually in the passenger seat. This is by far one of the most gruesome abandoned vehicle discoveries ever. The police actually had to pry open the doors with crowbars to reach the festering body inside. The bus itself, painted in gaudy colors of blue and green, was once a food truck serving national dishes from El Salvador. It had gotten parked on Liberty Avenue, and then it was just kind of forgotten about. Nobody paid the ugly thing any attention until a noxious odor began leaking out of it, and someone got curious enough to look in through the window. That was when the body was discovered. According to the New York Daily News, the dead guy had been a local vagrant who collected metal, sold it for scrap, and lived in the abandoned truck. By the time the cops got his body out, he'd been dead for a significant amount of time. He was basically already a mummy. Number 4. Abandoned race circuit. More than an abandoned vehicle, this is an entire abandoned race track. You could, if you really wanted, drive your performance car out here and race to your heart's content. At least as long as the police don't find out. The Circuit Flamenco in France is one of the most fascinating abandoned racetracks in the world. It was built back in 1920 and became a favorite racing circuit for the Grand Prix. The famous race car driver François Lescaut won the championship in 1926, driving his Bugatti T35B 2LC. The last Formula One race here was held in 1966. Motorcycle racing continued on the track until 1972, when the place had to shut down because of financial difficulties. A portion of the track was demolished in 2002, but some of it still remains to this day. You won't find any abandoned race cars here, but the pit stops are still around, as are the bleachers, parts of the racetrack, and a few old advertisements from local auto shops. Number 3. The Antarctic Snow Cruiser. Thomas Poulter designed the Antarctic Snow Cruiser between 1937 and 1939. It was meant to be a powerful all-terrain vehicle that would help United States scientists explore Antarctica during an expedition that began in 1940. Almost immediately upon the snow cruiser's arrival in Antarctica, the crew began to experience problems. They couldn't unload the thing from the ship and had to fashion a makeshift ramp. Then once they got the vehicle into the snow, it wouldn't move. The tires were designed to roll freely through the snow and ice, yet it wouldn't move at all. In fact, the vehicle sunk 3 feet, 1 meter into the snow. They ended up having to drive it in reverse, and they only got 92 miles, 150 kilometers. They were forced to abandon the snow cruiser when it became clear it would be of absolutely no help to anyone. The bizarre vehicle was rediscovered in 1946 by yet another expedition to Antarctica. They realized that the vehicle simply needed more air in its tires to make it operational. However, they were unable to do anything about it, and so they left it sitting there in the snow. By the time an international expedition came across the snow cruiser again in 1958, it was covered by 23 feet of snow. They only knew it was there because of a bamboo pole marking its position. They didn't have the ability to melt it out of its hole, so they left it there. Since then, there's been no trace of the mysterious snow cruiser. It's probably entombed somewhere deep under the ice, waiting for future explorers to uncover it in 100 years. Number 2. Tanks at Flamenco Beach. A serene, beautiful beach littered with the husks of old war machines? It's true. But why? Even today, Flamenco Beach in Puerto Rico is still covered in abandoned war tanks. It's one of the most serene and gorgeous landscapes anywhere in the Caribbean, with a beautiful shoreline marred by the rusting tanks left behind by the U.S. Navy. The history behind the tanks and how they got there goes back to 1901 when Spain handed Puerto Rico over to the United States. The president of the time, Theodore Roosevelt, gave the land of Flamenco Beach to the U.S. Navy, who used the beach for testing. Then in 1936, they used it for bombing practice. There was never an official base here, but they did move a ton of equipment into the area, including decommissioned tanks from World War II. They continued missile testing until 1969, bombing the paint right off the tanks. By the 1970s, the locals were getting angry about the unfettered military testing. The Navy was forced to clear out of there, but in their haste, they left behind a ton of stuff, including the tanks that still sit on the beach to this day. Someone should really clear them off the beach and turn it back into a tropical paradise, don't you think? Number 1. Abandoned ghost ship. There's an abandoned ship that recently appeared after being missing for over 9 years. The story of the ship goes back to 2009 when it vanished mysteriously in the Pacific Ocean. The last time the ship was seen, it had a full crew and was sailing away from the Taiwanese coast. The ship, called the Sam Rutalangi PB 1600, lost contact with the outside world, and nobody had any clue what happened to it. Almost 10 years later, it reappeared suddenly in the ocean south of Myanmar. A group of local fishermen were the first to find the vessel. Out of curiosity, they entered the ship and found nobody on board. The ship was totally empty, without crew or cargo. Nobody knows what happened to this thing in the years that it was seemingly nowhere on Earth. The best guess scientists can come up with is that the crew abandoned the vessel and ran away. However, their bodies have never been found, and they've never resurfaced in any country. It's as if they literally vanished into thin air, leaving the ship to wander the ocean as a ghost until it finally marooned itself on the shore. Would you dare step foot on a spooky ghost ship? Let us know in the comments down below, and thanks for watching. If you haven't already, be sure to hit the subscribe button for all the greatest videos from American Eye. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.